All right, this is one of my personal favorites to talk about. The material here I think is very interesting, and there's no secular explanation for what you're going to see today. Nothing. There really isn't. This only makes sense in a Christian worldview. What if there was a secret code built into numbers? Numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What if we analyzed them and found out there was a secret code built into numbers? That would be kind of mind-blowing, because a secret code like that implies that there's an intelligence that made that code, right? And we know that if there's, if you encounter a code and you're able to decode it and you find this secret message, you think, well, there's somebody really intelligent that made that. But who made numbers? We don't think about God making numbers. We think about God making the stars and the earth and so on. We talked about some of those things. But God is also responsible for abstract truths. All truth is in the mind of God, and that includes mathematical truths. God's mind is responsible for numbers. Human beings, we didn't invent numbers. We discovered them and the relationships between them, but we didn't invent them. And so it was a great surprise when in the 1980s, mathematicians discovered a code built into math, built into numbers, that has no secular explanation. You just can't explain what you're going to see today from anything other than a Christian worldview. But before we get into this really good stuff, and it is good, we have to do a little bit of preparatory work first. And that's not always as much fun. It's kind of like when I was a little kid and my mother would prepare these wonderful meals, but occasionally she would make something I didn't like broccoli. Yuck, right? But the rule was you had to eat everything on your plate before you could be excused to do other things. And so in rare moments of maturity, I would sometimes eat the broccoli first, kind of get that out of the way so that I could then enjoy the rest of the meal, right? In that same spirit, we have a little bit of broccoli to do first. But stay with me, because it's going to get really cool really quick, okay? And I want you to be able to enjoy the rest of the meal. So here's the preparatory work. We got to start with sets. A set in mathematics is a collection of, in this case, numbers. A collection of numbers that have a common defined property. And in most sets, some numbers are included, other numbers are excluded from the set. And so consider, for example, the set of even numbers. And so we take a look at those numbers there. Which ones belong to that set? The set of even numbers, those ones belong, and the others do not. That's the set of even numbers. It's an infinite set because they go, to positive infinity and negative infinity. But not all numbers are included, only some of them. We could also consider a different set, like the set of negative numbers. That's a different set. And it contains those numbers, but not the other ones, right? And there's some numbers that are members of both sets, like -2 is both in the set of even numbers, and it's also in the set of negative numbers, isn't it? Okay, so that's what a set is. It's just a group of numbers. Now, the two sets I've mentioned are pretty easy because you can tell just by looking at the number whether or not it belongs. In this case, negative numbers, it's pretty easy. All you have to do is look at it, and if it has a little negative sign in front of it, you know it belongs, right? And likewise, with the even numbers, you know if a number's even just by looking at it, because you know if it ends in 0, 2, 4, 6, or 8, it's even. But some sets, you can't tell just by looking at the number whether it belongs, because their definition's a little more complicated. We're going to look at a set that was explored in the 1980s. It's called the Mandelbrot set. And you can't tell just by looking at a number whether it belongs, because you have to test it with this little formula that you see there. The Mandelbrot set is defined as all the numbers C. C is a potential Mandelbrot number. We're testing to see whether it belongs, for which another number, Z, a sequence of Z, remains small according to that little formula that you see there. And so C is the number we're checking to see if it belongs to the Mandelbrot set. Z, and the fact that it's Z sub n, it tells you that there's not just one Z. There's a Z sub 0, Z sub 1, Z sub 2, Z sub... And each one of those holds a number. It's like a mailbox that holds a number in it. And the next value of Z, n plus 1, that means the next Z in the sequence, is related to the previous Z squared plus C, this number that we're checking to see if it's in the Mandelbrot set. And this set is defined such that if when we run it through that formula, if the sequence of Z stays small, then C does belong to the Mandelbrot set. If the sequence of Z does not remain small, if it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, then C does not belong to the Mandelbrot set. And I'll give you a couple of examples. It sounds complicated. It's not. It's a little tedious, but it's not complicated. So is the number 1 part of the Mandelbrot set? So C equals 1. That's the number we're checking to see if it belongs to the Mandelbrot set. Z always starts as 0. So we're going to put, so C is 1, because that's the number we're checking. Z always starts as 0. So the first number we're going to put in there is 0 squared. 0 times itself is 0. Plus 1 is 1, right? So that's the new value of Z. So we put that back in. We're going to keep track of our list of Z here. And we put that back into the formula. That's the new value of Z, so we put it back in, and this time we have 1 squared. 1 times 1 is 1, plus 1 is 2. And so we put that back in. 2 squared is 4, plus 1 is 5, and so that's the next value. We put that back in. 5 squared would be 25, plus 1 is 26, okay? That's the next value. We put that back in. 26 squared plus 1 is a really big number, and so on and so forth. Okay, you get the point. Now, is the sequence of Z staying small? No, you can see it's getting big. We don't have to do any more. We can see what's happening. It's getting big. So is the number 1 part of the Mandelbrot set? The answer is no. You got it, because the sequence of Z gets really big. Okay? Let's do one more just to make sure you got it, because I know it's kind of tedious. Let's see, is -1 part of the Mandelbrot set? So this time, C is -1, so we're going to put -1 into our formula. So of Z squared minus 1 is the next value of Z. Z always starts as 0, so we're just going to start with 0 squared minus 1. 0 squared would be 0, minus 1 would be -1, and so that's our next value of Z. So we put that back in. Now -1 squared, -1 times -1 is +1, minus 1 would be 0. So that's our next value of Z. So we put that back in. This looks familiar. 0 squared minus 1 is -1. Oh, you see what's happening? 0, -1, 0, -1, 0, -1, 0. And they'll do that forever. We don't have to do any more. We can see what's happening. Is the sequence of Z staying small? Yes, it is. So is -1 part of the Mandelbrot set? Yes, it is. There you go. Easy peasy. Okay? Tedious, but easy. There's one more complication, and then we'll get to the really good stuff. The additional complication is that the Mandelbrot set also includes what we call complex and imaginary numbers. And I hate that terminology, especially imaginary, because it makes it sound like they don't exist. Imaginary numbers do exist. It's just a name. It's a name we give to numbers that are the square root of a negative. And so in the sort of prototype imaginary number, we label it with a lowercase I, and by definition, I squared is equal to -1. Or if you prefer, I is the square root of -1. Okay? And that's a little hard for people to grasp because, how do we think about a number that when you multiply it by itself, you get a negative? How do you explain that? Because imaginary numbers are not positive because a positive number squared is positive, isn't it? Like 2 squared is 4 and so on. Imaginary numbers are not negative because a negative number squared is also positive, isn't it? Like -2 times -2 is +4. And imaginary numbers are not 0 either because 0 squared is 0. How do we have a number that's not positive, not negative, and not 0? And some of you are thinking, well, you just can't because those are the 3 options. Well, you can actually. And if it bothers you, that's okay. It's kind of like when you're a little kid, negative numbers bother you, right? Because you say, I understand how I can have 1 apple or 2 apples, but how can I have -3 apples, right? But then you get a little bit older, you get a bank account, suddenly negative numbers make a lot of sense, right? Yeah. Yes, I can have less than nothing. If you have a mortgage, you know what I'm talking about. Okay. Imaginary numbers are the same way. It's just that most adults never have a lot of experience with imaginary numbers, but they do exist. There is a class of number that's not positive, not negative, and not 0. It's just most of us never have a lot of experience with them, but they do exist. How do we think of a number that's not positive, not negative, and not 0? Well, imagine the number line. So you get the numbers going out all the way from -infinity, all the way through 0, all the way to positive infinity, okay? And the positive numbers would be to the right of 0, wouldn't they? The negative numbers would be to the left of 0, wouldn't they? How do I think of a number that's not positive? It's not to the right of 0. It's not negative. It's not to the left of 0, but it's also not 0. What if I put it up there? Oh, that's an interesting way to think about it, right? Because it's not to the right, it's not to the left, it's not positive, it's not negative, and yet it's not zero. It's along a different axis. You can think of the imaginary numbers as being along a different axis from the other numbers. And again, I hate the term imaginary. And to add insult to injury, the numbers that are not imaginary are called real. It's just a name. It's just a name. That's what they call it. What can I say? And by multiplying the number I, remember I, by definition, I squared is -1. But if you multiply I by any of the real numbers, like a half, you get a half I and so on, or -half I. You can get all the other imaginary numbers by multiplying I by any of the real numbers. And so you have a different number line, kind of. And if you want to, you can also plot a point out to the side there that has a real part, a part that's to the right or left of 0, and an imaginary part, a part that's above or below 0. And we call this a complex number because it has two parts. It's one number, but it has two parts. It has a real part that gives you the direction along the x-axis, and it has an imaginary part that gives you the direction in the y-axis. Now, the neat thing about complex numbers is you can use one number to indicate any point on a plane, and that's pretty neat, right? Because it's two-dimensional. Now, it wouldn't work if you went in 3 dimensions, but for 2 dimensions, it works great. The real component gives you the x position on the plane, and the imaginary component gives you the y position on the plane. Now, okay, so now we understand. Now, the Mandelbrot set also includes these complex numbers. And mathematicians in the 20th century were very interested in things like the Mandelbrot set because you can't tell just by looking at the number whether or not it belongs. You had to run it through that little formula. And in the 1980s, computers were becoming fast enough that they could run through that formula pretty quickly and discover whether the sequence of Z remains small, whether the number does belong to the Mandelbrot set, or whether it gets big and the number does not belong to the Mandelbrot set. And they thought, let's make a map to see if there's a pattern. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to make a map of the Mandelbrot set. Points that do belong to the Mandelbrot set, we're going to color those black. Remember, we checked -1, and we found that the sequence of Z stays small, right? Because it goes -1, 0, -1, 0. So that does belong, and we'll color it black. If we had checked 0, we'd find it just stays 0. When you run it through the formula, it goes 0, 0, 0, 0. So it remains small as well. So those numbers do belong to the Mandelbrot set. And we'll have the computer check other numbers, not just the real numbers, but also the imaginary and the complex numbers. And the computer can do this very quickly. And if it finds the number does belong, it colors it black. And so we'll do this for more and more points, and we'll find that there is a pattern. A shape starts to emerge. What about points that do not belong to the Mandelbrot set? Well, we'll color those red, some other color, okay? Remember, we checked the number 1, and then we found it got bigger and bigger and bigger. The sequence of Z got really big. So we'll color it red. And other points that do not belong, we'll color those red as well. So the computer's basically going through checking points, and if it finds the sequence of Z stays small, it does belong, it colors it black. If it finds it doesn't belong, it colors it red. And we find that there is a pattern, a shape is emerging. And the shape that emerged was something that no one expected. Because you might think, oh, it'll be like a circle or something. It's not. It's a really interesting shape. And so as we check more and more points and we check them at finer scales, the shape that emerges is this. This is a map of which points belong to the Mandelbrot set. So if it's black, it does belong. If it's colored, it doesn't. And I shaded the colors so that if the sequence of Z gets really big really fast, I gave it kind of a dark red color. So that's far away from the Mandelbrot set. And then if the sequence of Z gets big, but it does so slowly, I gave it a bright color like yellow. So yellow are points that are really close to the Mandelbrot set, but they don't belong to it. And that makes the shape easier to see if you color it that way. The colors are arbitrary, but points that are black do belong. So does the point 1/2 I belong to the Mandelbrot set? You can say, yes, it does, because it's black, you see. And we already checked -1. If you checked negative, I don't know what that is, but negative, what is that? -1 and a quarter, it does belong, or somewhere around there. Now we have a map. The computer's done all the work for us, and so we can simply look at this map and detect whether a point belongs. But the thing that was interesting is not so much that we now have a convenient map, but the map itself is a shape that no one had expected. No one had expected that when you make a map of which points belong to Z squared plus C, you would get this remarkable shape. That's amazing. So you'll notice three main features of this set. The biggest shape is this heart-shaped feature called a cardioid. Now, a cardioid is what happens when you take a circle and you roll it around a circle of equal size, keeping your pencil affixed to one point on the outer circle, like this. That's a cardioid, heart-shaped, right? And you can see that is exactly the main shape of the Mandelbrot set there, of the map of the Mandelbrot set. Neat. The other shapes you might notice are perfect circles, and they are perfect circles. And there are just millions of them. Some of them are tiny, and some of them are quite large, like this one right here is the largest one. And then finally, the other feature you'll notice, you got the cardioid, you got the circles, and you'll see these little squiggly antennae that stem away from it, these little squiggly lines up there, and so on. And there's one that's perfectly straight. That's kind of forms the tail of this little bug, right? Isn't that fascinating? And we found that when you zoom in on this, and we can zoom in by having the computer plot at smaller and smaller scale. It's checking the points at increased resolution. And when you do that, we can zoom in, for example, on this upper region, and we find that this map has some really interesting properties that no one was expecting. For example, the large circle that you see at the top there, it's got a circle on top of that and a circle on top of that, and then it forms this little branch that branches out into two others for a total of 3. You see how that branch there? There's 1, 2, 3 total. Neat, okay. If you look at the next one down to the left, it branches into 5. Can you see that? 1, including the trunk. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The next one down, 7. The next one down, 9, 11, 13, 15, 17, 19, like clockwork. Each one has 2 more antennae than the previous one. That's interesting. Why is that? I have no idea. No idea. I'm sure there's a reason. I just don't know what it is. And if you go on the other side to the right, you'd say, well, you can see it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. It's 5, 6. So the right side has all the numbers, even then the left side just has the odd numbers all the way. And they don't stop, by the way. They keep getting small. You might think, well, how many are there? 100, 1,000, 1,000,000? There's an infinite number of them. They get smaller and smaller and smaller. Well, how can you pack an infinite number in between there and there? And the answer is you make them infinitely small. That's how you do it. You can pack an infinite number of things in a finite distance if the things you're packing get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Neat. So they go all the way down, all the odd numbers, all the way down to infinity, odd infinity, whatever that means. And then the other side, all the numbers, evens and odds. So the Mandelbrot set somehow knows how to count. That's wild. What's even wilder, consider this circle there and that circle there. This one branches into 3, that one branches into 5, right? This one branches into 3, that one branches into 5. What about the one in between them? How many does that have? Well, it turns out it has 8, which is interesting because 5 plus 3 is 8. And that's exactly how many that one has. And it turns out, what about the one in between these two? It adds 5 and 7, it's 12. It has 12. And likewise on the other side. And it turns out that's true for all of them. You pick any 2 circles, the next largest one in between them will add the number of antennae. And it doesn't matter which 2 you pick. Somehow the Mandelbrot set not only knows how to count, it knows how to add. All we're doing is looking at a map of which points belong to z squared plus c, and it has these amazing properties that no one was expecting. That's interesting. One of the really neat properties of the Mandelbrot set we're going to take a look at now. Keep in mind the overall shape. You got the big cardioid here, and then you got circles growing off of it, a big circle right there, and then this tail, this little spike out there. And the spike has a little black spot on it. You see that? Well, when we zoom in on that, it turns out it's a smaller version of the original. That's amazing. No one was expecting that. I mean, God knew about it, but it was a surprise to us. And this baby version, it's almost identical to the parent. It's got a big cardioid right there, and then it's got circles, and it's got a spike growing off of it. It does have a few things that are different. It has extra spikes growing off the exterior, which is interesting. We zoomed in on a baby that's on the spike of the parent, and the baby has extra spikes growing off of it. That's interesting. But you'll notice that this little baby version also has a little black spot there. What could that possibly be? Well, it turns out it's another one. How about that? And this one also has a little black spot on it, which turns out is another one, and so on and so forth. I hope one of the things you learned in the previous session that I gave is that God is sovereign over the infinitely big, but what we see here is that God is also sovereign over the infinitely small. As far as we know, this goes forever. Not that anyone has checked. You don't have enough time. But there have been programs that have zoomed in by a factor of like a Google, right? That 10 to the power of 100, right? That's what it meant before the search engine came along. Yeah, okay. Amazing. And look how small this grandbaby is compared to the original. Look at that. It's tiny. And in case you're wondering, there's no bigger version. If you zoom out, the rest of the universe is empty. So that's the atom. That's the first one right there. And all the babies grow off of that. Pretty amazing. A shape like this that has an infinite number of small versions built into itself is called a fractal. So this is an example. The Mandelbrot set is an example of a fractal. You zoom in on it and you get smaller versions of the same shape. And it's not just the overall shape that repeats. If you zoom into any one section of that shape, you'll find that you can basically zoom in forever because it's infinitely wiggly. It's as wiggly as is possible in 2 dimensions. And in fact, the Mandelbrot set, because it's infinitely wiggly, has an infinite perimeter, which is remarkable. It just blows my mind to even think about it. But you could do that for the rest of your life. And you wouldn't even scratch the surface. You could do that for the rest of eternity, and you wouldn't scratch the surface. It goes forever. It's infinitely wiggly. You zoom in on a wiggle, you get a smaller wiggle. You zoom in on that smaller wiggle, you get a smaller wiggle, and so on. Amazing. Well, it's fun to explore the properties of this map that has been built into numbers since creation. It's just we didn't know about it until the 1980s, which makes you wonder what other things the Lord has in store for us. We're going to zoom in on this valley that's between the main cardioid and the main disc. So the valley between the main cardioid and the main disc right there. We'll zoom in on that. This mathematicians call this the valley of the seahorses, because if you look on the right side, it looks like upside down seahorses. Isn't that fascinating? Now, the colors are arbitrary, and every now and then we'll change them just to keep things interesting. But points that do belong to the Mandelbrot set, those are always black, just by convention. Points that don't belong, we can give them other colors just to keep things interesting. And let's zoom in on one of these seahorses. And one of the things I want to point out, remember, black means it does belong to the set. It means if you plot that point and run it through the formula, Z will stay small. Colored means it's not part of the Mandelbrot set. If you take a point out here, out in this area, and you run it through that formula, Z will get very big. Bright points mean that it's very close to being on the Mandelbrot set, but not quite. And you can see the points that are very close to black are very brightly colored. But you might think, well, wait a minute, what about this section over here? This section right here, what about that? I mean, that's very brightly colored, but it doesn't look like it's close to black. Actually, it is. You see there's this infinitely thin black thread that goes out and wiggles around there and makes that shape. So just the fact that you don't see any black there doesn't mean there isn't any. It's just smaller than a pixel. The computer can't see it. We'd have to zoom in on it. But there is a Mandelbrot set out there. And so these points are very close to a very thin black thread that's wiggled around and made that shape. So again, I have to remind you, what you're looking at here is just a map of which points belong to the Mandelbrot set, despite the fact it's incredibly beautiful and incredibly complex. I found that if you zoom in on the center of that hub, you can do that forever and nothing really changes. It's a smaller version of itself. That's a fractal. So let's go off to the side and find out what this kind of spider web type structure is made of, and you'll find it's made of smaller spider webs. That's remarkable. Continue to zoom in on one of these. Now there's 2 centers here. There's a center up at the top, another one at the bottom. You see that? One at the top, one at the bottom. And in the middle, there's 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And as you continue to zoom in, it goes to 8 to 16. And in the middle, oh, look at that. See? 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Then 16, 32, all the powers of 2. And in the middle is a little baby Mandelbrot set. Again, remarkably. Just a tiny, tiny version of the original. Isn't that remarkable? Absolutely amazing. And by the way, you might notice that Mandelbrot has a little spot there at the end. Yeah, and you know what that is. Yeah, there we go. So, amazing. And by the way, this little baby version, It also has a valley of seahorses right there. It has a valley of seahorses right there, which you could zoom in on and you could get another version of this. So this is just one little baby that we zoomed in on, and it itself has an infinite number of babies. Think about that. So the Mandelbrot set has an infinite number of babies, and each of those babies has an infinite number of babies. It's not just infinity, it's an infinity of infinities. And if that blows your mind, it blows mine. God's not just infinite, he's infinitely infinite. Yeah, and yes, there are different infinities. If you can talk to mathematicians that there are different infinities and some are larger than others, as surprising as that is. And as we zoom back out, look how tiny that is compared to the original. It's just this tiny little speck in a map of numbers. Absolutely remarkable. Well, let's go back to the Valley of the Seahorses. This time we'll go off to the left, which they call the Valley of the Double Spirals. And that's because there are these beautiful spirals. They remind me of spiral galaxies, but it's a double spiral. You have two strands that wrap around each other. And if we zoom in on this, I find the beauty just outrageous, just wonderful. Isn't that beautiful? Who would have imagined that God had built beauty into numbers? But there it is. Revealed when you run them through the little formula z squared plus c. That's the shape you get. It's stunning. You have these little structures in here. I call them bow ties. They look like a little bow tie. It's two double spirals that intersect in the middle. And if we zoom in on the middle, once again, you get a baby Mandelbrot. Isn't that wonderful? And you can see it's almost identical to the parent, but we zoomed in on a section of the parent that is a double spiral, and so the baby has a bunch of double spirals growing around the outside, and they're stunningly beautiful. Isn't that amazing? Who could have imagined that such beauty would be built into numbers? But when God is thinking through numbers, numbers stem from the mind of God. That was in his mind. And not only that, but an infinite number of these, with all that incredible beauty surrounding them. It's stunning. And I'll try to go through what are some of the secular explanations later, but I'm going to, spoiler alert, this comes from God. That's why this makes sense in a Christian worldview. Another valley we can explore, it's called the Valley of the Elephants. It's the main crevice on the cardioid right here, then the heart-shaped feature. And so if we zoom in on that, the structures look like these little elephants. You see, it looks like one elephant marching after the next, with the trunks kind of curled up. And the top is a mirror image. These are elephants hanging from the ceiling. But let's zoom in on a couple of them. So there you have that elephant shape with the trunk that curls up. And each one of them is growing off of one of these circles. So you have a circle there and then an elephant, and then you have a circle there and an elephant, right? Circle there and an elephant, circle there and an elephant. And they get small as you go farther into the valley, the elephants get smaller and smaller and smaller. There's an infinite number of them, because they continue to get smaller. You think, well, it's going to end at some point. It never does. They just keep getting smaller and smaller, and the trunks get curlier, too, as you go in, which is kind of interesting. So, but each circle has one elephant growing on it, like an elephant on a circus ball, right? And that's important. We'll come back to that later. But one circle, one elephant. And I thought, well, what happens if I zoom into that curly trunk? What does it look like? It's incredibly beautiful. So again, you have a spiral. This is a single spiral. It's not a double. It's one loop wrapped around itself. And if you zoom in on the structures of that, you get these little bow tie shapes where you have two spirals that intersect in the middle. And as we zoom in on that, and zoom in more, it goes from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32, all the powers of 2. And in the middle, there's another one. Remarkable. I found that anywhere that you have two spirals that kind of intersect, if you look at the point of intersection, it's always a baby Mandelbrot in there. So I've kind of learned how to find these as I've explored this shape over the years. So, but stunningly beautiful. Look at all the material that's growing around it. It's really stunning. All that built into this little formula, z squared plus c, by the Creator, for his glory ultimately, but perhaps for our enjoyment as well. Isn't that amazing? Now, you could spend the rest of your life exploring that shape because it's infinite. It's not infinitely big, it's infinitely small. The structure doesn't stop. You can zoom in forever and you'll still find smaller and smaller baby versions of the Mandelbrot set as you zoom in. That's just a map of which numbers belong to z squared plus c, such that when you run them through that formula, z stays small. That's the shape you get. You could spend the rest of your life studying that. You could spend all eternity studying that, because it's not only infinite, it's infinitely infinite, which means even if you spent all eternity studying it, the fraction that you would have explored would be 0. Wild. That gives you a little insight into the mind of God. It also produces in me a profound sense of humility. We know nothing compared to God. Literally nothing compared to God. But that's just one formula. You could spend the rest of your life exploring that formula. It's one formula. What happens if you change the formula? Well, I wanted to know, so I changed the formula. What if I make it z cubed plus c? I find if you change c to something else, it just distorts the shape. It stretches it out or rotates it or whatever. But if you change the power, you get a different shape. Interesting. So this shape, we call this, again, this is the Mandelbrot set. Now this is a multiple of the Mandelbrot, so we call this a multibrot set, okay? And so that's z cubed plus c, and it looks like that. Interesting. Is it fractal? Does it have smaller versions of itself built into it? We'll come back to that. One of the things I found that was interesting too, because computers can plot these shapes pretty quick. What if you change the power gradually from 2 to 3? What if you go 2.1 and 2.2, 2.3, 2.4 and plot the shape? You can watch one morph into the other. So this is kind of interesting. Oh, let me back out. I wanted to point out the main shape here is not a cardioid, but a nephroid. A nephroid is where you take a circle half the size of the original and roll it around. The original. That's a nephroid. And you can see that's the main shape of this new Multibrot. See? But notice everything's gone up by 1. The Mandelbrot set had 1 valley in its main shape. It was over here, the Valley of the Elephants. This one has 2. It's got 1 there and 1 there. The Mandelbrot had circles growing off of it, which have 0 valleys. This has cardioids growing off of it, which have 1 valley. And then back to what I was saying, if you change the power gradually to 2.1, 2.2, you can watch the Mandelbrot morph into the Multibrot. Isn't that neat? Then I'll run it back so you can see how it originated. So you can see how everything gets doubled. Some things get quadrupled. Most things get doubled. Isn't that interesting? Now, what is least changed when this shape changes into the next one? I think the least changed area is right here. Would you agree with that? It seems like that. Everything else is really moving, and this stays relatively the same. So I wanted to know if in this new Multibrot, is there a Valley of Elephants there? So let's zoom in on here and see if there's a Valley of Elephants, because that's what there was on the Mandelbrot set. Yes, indeed, there are elephants. Let's zoom in. Interesting. Now remember, previously, we had 1 circle and 1 elephant on it. But the circles have become cardioids. They've divided. And so now you have 2 elephants on each cardioid, which is interesting because previously we had an infinite number of elephants, and now we have twice that many. That's going to keep you up tonight. Well, what happens if we zoom in on these guys? What happens if you zoom in on the trunk? You think we'll have those little bow tie shapes again? Let's find out. We do, but they've become 3 instead of 2. See? 1, 2, 3. Like little fidget spinners, right? And if we zoom in on the center of that, it's a baby version of the Multibrot. Here's the original, there's the baby, almost identical. So this Multibrot is also fractal. It repeats, it has baby versions of itself built into itself on smaller scales. Remarkable. I also tried other powers. Z to the 4th, you get that shape. Z to the 5th, that shape. Now these are infinite, like the Mandelbrot set. You pick any one of these, you could spend the rest of eternity studying it. But there's an infinite number of them to study. God is not just infinite, he's infinitely infinite. I found if you go to Z to the 7th, you can get snowflakes. That's kind of neat. And if you zoom in on this, do you get snowflakes? Yes, you do. Yeah, you do. You get smaller and smaller snowflakes. It's beautiful. I also tried negative powers. Negative powers, that's the reciprocal, so z to the negative 2 is the reciprocal of z squared. And what this does is it flips it inside out. Because remember, black means it does belong to the set, colored means it doesn't. These are all black. So the entire universe does belong to this set, except this little section in the middle. That's the only section that doesn't. So it flips it inside out. And if you zoom in on this, you find that you have these wonderful little, it looks like overlapping pebbles. They're not really, they're two-dimensional shapes, but I found this is a very different kind of a fractal. Isn't that amazing? Is it fractal? Well, the overall shape doesn't repeat because it's infinitely big, it can't. But does this basic pattern repeat? Yes, it does. And it does so infinitely. Again, you could zoom in on that for the rest of your life and you would never scratch the surface because it's infinite. Just a little window into what it must be like to think like God. Just gives us a little taste of it. I tried other negative powers, -3, -4, -5. That's another way to make snowflakes there, inside-out snowflakes. The beauty that is built into math as we explore these different shapes is truly stunning. And yet all you're looking at is a graph of which points belong to a formula. That's it, running the numbers through. So when God is thinking through numbers, he had this in mind. And we've only recently discovered this, because it wasn't until 1980s that we had computers fast enough to do this. So what does all this mean? I mean, are we just looking at pretty pictures that a computer made or what? I mean, is this all sound and fury signifying nothing, or is there purpose to it? What causes the beauty in fractals? What makes them so pretty? How did that result? What causes the complexity in fractals? The fact that they can add and they can count and so on, and that they get wigglier as you go in. Let's start with the first. What causes the beauty in fractals? Is it the man-made color scheme? I chose the colors for these sets. And you can get computer programs that pick different colors, and some of the colors they pick aren't always very good, and shame on them, because I think this is very pretty if you use the right colors. But my point is, it's not really the man-made color scheme, because even if I take away all the color and make it grayscale, it's still beautiful. There's something about the shape that is attractive, isn't it? You don't have to have a sense. You can be colorblind. You can still appreciate the beauty in fractals. They're still stunning. So it's not the man-made color scheme. I think that helps bring out the shape a little bit. Maybe the way salt brings out the flavor in the food, but it doesn't create it. Did the computer create the beauty? Well, the problem is the computer really didn't create these shapes. Remember, these shapes are built into numbers. The computer simply revealed these shapes, and it did it quickly. Theoretically, you could plot these by hand, right? We did the first 2 points manually. Remember, we did -1, and then we did 1, and then we found one belongs and the other doesn't. You could do that with all the points. It would just take a long time, but you could. And you'd find it, yep, there's that shape, and so on. The computer didn't make it. It simply revealed it quickly. Did people make this? We picked the formula, but we didn't have any idea what would result when we did. The shape, by the way, the Mandelbrot, it's named after Benoit Mandelbrot, who popularized this back in the 80s. He was a programmer at IBM, but he was surprised that the shape ended up like that. No human being sat down and said, I think I'm going to make this heart shape, and then I'm going to draw an infinite number of circles on it, and I'm going to draw an infinite number. You don't have time to draw an infinite number of anything, right? No human being made this. It's infinite. We can't make things that are infinite. The beauty is somehow built into math. What causes the complexity in fractals? The fact that they have smaller versions built into them. The fact that they have these mathematical properties. Did the computer create it? Well, again, no. The computer simply revealed it quickly. The computer doesn't create fractals any more than a microscope creates bacteria. A microscope allows you to see what's there, what has already been there. The computer allows us to see these shapes that are built into the abstract world of math that have been there since creation. It's just only recently we had computers powerful enough to explore these shapes. It didn't create it. Did human beings create it? No, because we can't create infinite things. Now, we get to pick the formula, but we found that it doesn't matter what formula you pick, right? So that's my next question. Did the formula create it? The formula revealed complexity that's already in numbers. But if you change the formula, you still see complexity in numbers. So it's not about the formula. The formula does determine the specific properties of the shape, but the fact you have to feed numbers into it. Apparently, the complexity is built into math. Well, what's math? I mean, we sort of know what that is. Math is the study of the relationship between numbers. When you learn how numbers interact with numbers, that you're doing math. So addition, multiplication, so on. You get to the more complex stuff, algebra, calculus. It's how numbers interact with numbers, the relationships between numbers. But here's a question most people don't think to ask. What are numbers? It's, oh, come on, Lisle. You know what numbers are. Have you ever tried to define one? I mean, it's interesting. These things that we use every day, how would you define it? Sometimes the things that we use that are closest to us are harder to define because we haven't thought about it very much. The best definition I could find in a dictionary is that numbers are a concept of quantity. I think that's a good definition. Numbers are a concept of quantity. So quantity is how much of something you have. And if you're thinking about, a concept is a thought. If you're thinking about how much of something there is, you're thinking a number. That's what a number is. It's a concept of quantity. But here's the thing. Numbers are concepts, meaning they're abstract in nature. They're not physical. They exist in the mind. That's where concepts live. They live in the mind, right? That's where, because a concept is a thought. Thoughts exist in a mind. And you might say, well, I don't know, that number 3 there, that doesn't exist in the mind. That exists on the screen. But is that really the number 3? Because if it is, I just destroyed the number 3. And children will now have to count 1, 2, 4, 5, 7, right? You told me that was 3 and I destroyed it, so there's no more 3, right? Oh no, that was a representation of the number 3. That was a numeral. Numerals are not numbers, they are expressions, they're representations of numbers. And I can express 3 in different ways. I could express it by that little squiggly thing you saw, or I could express it by 3 vertical lines. That's how the Romans did it, right? Roman numerals. But you see the Roman numeral 3 and the way we write it, the Arabic 3, they represent the same concept, don't they? Threeness. The concept lives in the mind. We decided how numbers should be written, numerals should be written, but we don't create numbers. And laws of math are conceptual. They live in the mind. Well, where do laws of math come from? Like the Pythagorean theorem or the commutative property of multiplication. Did they evolve? Think about that, because we've seen that laws of math, when you run the numbers through them, you get these incredibly beautiful complex structures. Secular biologists notice that organisms have incredibly complex structures, and the secularists say, when you ask a secular biologist, how do you account for the complexity of the human body or some other organism? They'll say, well, it didn't start that way. It started very simple, but over time it became complex through evolution. Now, I would reject that, right? But the point is, that's a non-starter with math, because numbers don't evolve. It's not like 7 used to be 3, but then it evolved, right? Did 2 plus 2 ever equal anything than 4? That has always been that way. Numbers do not change. And so you cannot account for the complexity in math through evolution. You can't really do it with biology either, but it's easier to fool people with biology because biological things do change. Math doesn't. That's a non-starter. Were laws of math created by people? If they were, we could have made it a lot simpler, right? Students are like, why is this so hard? Why don't we set everything equal to 1 and then just be done with it? Well, because they weren't created by people. Nobody decided, no human being decided that 2 plus 2 equals 4. We discovered that 2 plus 2 equals 4. When the Greeks finally discovered the so-called irrational numbers, numbers that cannot be expressed as an integer divided by another integer like pi, they were very distressed about that. They didn't like it. They would not have invented irrational numbers because they didn't like them, but there they are. They discovered them. Laws of math weren't created by people, they were discovered by people. Do they come from the universe? Some people claim that. Math, it comes from the way the universe is mathematical. And I'll grant the universe obeys math, but that's not really the issue. Math doesn't come from the universe because 2 plus 2 would equal 4 even if there were no universe. Right? Mathematical truths are logical truths. They would exist even if the universe didn't. And by the way, laws of math go beyond the universe. I remember one of the things I thought was fascinating in one of my calculus classes is when we learned to calculate. You probably learned in high school that the volume of a cube is 4/3 pi r cubed. But in calculus, you learn to prove that. You can demonstrate that's what it is. The neat thing about calculus, though, is you can do it in multiple dimensions. If there were, like a sphere is three-dimensional, what if the universe was four-dimensional? What would be the volume, the hypervolume of a four-dimensional sphere? And in calculus, you can compute what that is. But the universe is three-dimensional in terms of space. So my point is, math goes beyond the physical universe. The universe only has the three dimensions of space, one of time. But in math, there's a thing called Hilbert space that has infinite number of dimensions. And you can do math in it, and it's meaningful, even though it doesn't apply to this universe. So math doesn't come from the universe. Math goes beyond the universe. That's interesting. The universe is smaller than the world of math. I would argue that laws of math stem from the mind of God. Math is the way God thinks about numbers. When you're doing math, you're doing theology. You're learning to think in a way that's consistent with God's mind. That's why it's hard. So your students, because young students, well, this is hard. When am I ever going to use this anyway? You're learning to think like God. I wonder if students realized that they were doing theology when they're doing math, if that might change their perspective on it a little bit. Yeah, it's going to be hard. You're learning to think like your Creator. He's infinite. And it's a gift that we can do math at all. It's because we're made in God's image that we can do these kind of things. That's why you don't have dogs or squirrels building digital computers. God loves them too, but they're not made in His image. We can think in a way that's consistent with God's character. We can do math. That's one way we can think in a way that's consistent with God's character. If you think about what laws of math are, they are conceptual, meaning they exist in the mind. They're universal, meaning they apply everywhere. They're invariant, meaning they don't change with time. And they're exceptionless, meaning, there's no exceptions to them. They always work. And if you think about it, that makes sense because God's thoughts are conceptual. God is omnipresent, and so his thinking would apply to the entire universe. God doesn't change with time, therefore math doesn't change with time because it reflects His thinking. And they're exceptionless because God is sovereign. All truth is in Christ, according to Colossians 2:3. All the treasures of wisdom and knowledge are deposited in Christ. And so all truth is in the mind of God, and that's why there are no exceptions to it. I can make sense of the laws of math and their properties because they flow from the mind of God. Math is a reflection of the way God thinks about numbers. And we have the capacity to think a little bit mathematical because we're made in God's image. And that's why it's such a wonderful gift, and so on. But the naturalist has a problem. The naturalist believes that nature's all that there is. There's no God, at least there's no transcendent God. The only minds that exist are the minds of people. But wait a minute. Laws of math are conceptual, right? They exist in the mind. We just demonstrated that. When math it lives in a mind. But laws of math existed before people. The way the planets orbit the sun, Kepler's laws, one of the Kepler's laws is p squared equals a cubed. That relates the period of a planet to its distance from the sun. That obeys math. The way the planets orbit obeys math. But wait a minute, planets were orbiting before people existed for 2 days. But they were. And in the secular view, they were orbiting for millions of years before people existed. So you see my point? The naturalist would say, laws of math require a mind. The only minds in the universe are human minds. But wait a minute, the universe obeyed math before there were human minds. There has to be a mind beyond the universe for the universe to obey math. The naturalist is stuck here. There's no answer from his perspective. I want to briefly talk about physical fractals. The fractals we've looked at are found in the world of math. They only exist, they're made of numbers, they exist in the mind. We can plot them, but they're not tangible. You can't touch the Mandelbrot set, right? Because it exists in the mind. It exists in the world of numbers. But there are physical fractals, things that are made up of atoms that you can touch that are at least approximately fractal. Now they're not infinite like the mathematical fractals. Math is infinite. You can zoom in forever, or you can zoom out forever, but either way. The physical universe, you can only zoom in so much and eventually get down to atoms and quarks and it becomes sort of wave-length. But nonetheless, there are approximate fractals that repeat many times and then eventually stop. For example, snowflakes. Yeah, if you live in Colorado, you're familiar with these little gems. And they come down from heaven and we scrape them off our car. But they're actually quite beautiful when you look at them under a microscope. And they are fractal in nature. You zoom in on a snowflake, you get a smaller snowflake. That same six-fold symmetry repeats due to the shape of the water molecule and so on. Lovely. That stuff that grows on your windows sometimes when the humidity and temperature's just right is fractal, because it branches and then it branches into smaller branches that look like the larger branches but are smaller, which branch into smaller ones and so on. Quite stunning. I was always amazed by that when I was a kid, and frankly, I still am. I think it's beautiful. Ferns. Ferns are fractal because the main branch branches into smaller branches, which branch into smaller branches and smaller branches until you get down to the leaves. Neat and fractal. This particular shape right here, it's fractal. You can see it's a cone, and it's got smaller cones, and it's smaller cones and smaller cones, and it turns out it's a form of broccoli, so I guess broccoli is good for something after all. There you go. That's called Romanesco broccoli if you want to try it. So, but see how it's cones made of smaller cones made of smaller cones? It's fractal. The way coastlines branch is fractal. You might have noticed some of Colonel Williams' photos that you get smaller and smaller structures. A lot of Earth's features are fractal. The way mountains branch, the valleys in between the mountains, and then they branch into smaller valleys, which branch into smaller ones, it's fractal. Clouds are fractal. Am I looking at the entire sky, or am I zoomed in on one small section of a cloud? Hard to tell, because the small resembles the large. Scale invariance, that's what a fractal possesses. Lightning is fractal in terms of the way it branches, because it branches and then the branches branch into smaller branches, which branch into smaller branches, and so on. It's quite stunning, actually. And when you photograph lightning in super high-speed cameras, you can actually see the branching happening in real time. You can see it branching and branching into smaller branches until the leader connects, and then most of the current goes down the leader. So lightning is fractal. So here's my question. Why do fractals occur both in math, which lives in the mind, and the physical world, which doesn't? Why do fractals like that? That's one of the Multibrot sets. That doesn't exist physically, but that does. Why? That shape right there is part of the Mandelbrot set, branching and branching into branches. That doesn't exist physically, but that does. That particular shape that may look like a plant, that's not. That's a mathematical graph. It's called a Barnsley fern. It's a mathematical construction where each leaf is the entire shape. Let me show you. Take the entire shape, becomes one of its own leaves. Look at that. And you can do that again. And you can do it again. You can do it forever because the entire shape is each leaf. Isn't that fascinating? It's a Barnsley fern. You can't touch that. It exists as a computer plot. It's not made up of atoms. It exists mentally. But that you can touch. This particular shape here is a mathematical graph. It doesn't exist in the physical universe, but this does. It grows on your windows. This particular shape is a mathematical graph. It does not exist in the physical universe, but this, unfortunately, does. That particular shape, that exists in the mind. It is part of the Mandelbrot set. You can't see it in a telescope, but you can see that in a telescope, and I have. The Whirlpool Galaxy. Why do fractals occur both in math, which exists only in the mind, and in the physical world, which does not exist in the mind? Now, one answer, and it's not a bad answer, is that the physical universe obeys mathematical laws. So it stands to reason if fractals can occur in math, they can occur in the physical universe because the physical universe obeys math. Granted. But that's only a partial answer because now I'm going to ask, why does the physical universe obey math? The physical universe isn't an idea, it's tangible, you can touch it, right? And yet, it feels constrained to obey these rules that exist in the mind. Logical rules. Why is that the case? Now, I can answer that as a Christian, because this universe is controlled by a mind, and it's the mind of God. The same mind that is responsible for the Mandelbrot set, that is responsible for all the rules of mathematics, is the same mind that is controlling the universe. Of course, the universe would have to obey math. From a Christian perspective, the universe would have to obey math. And it does. It's upheld by the mind of God. We saw the verses earlier that Christ upholds all things by the word of his power, and in him all things consist or hold together. But the secular worldview can't answer that. Because in the secular worldview, there is no mind over the universe. And so why would a physical universe obey mental laws? They can't explain the properties of the laws of mathematics or why the universe is compelled to obey them, or how we can discover these laws. See, I can even make sense of how we can discover laws of mathematics because we are made in God's image. And God has given us the capacity to think, albeit in a limited way, in a way that's consistent with his character. He has given us access to some of his thoughts. Isn't that awesome? And that's why we can do math. The secular worldview can't explain why there are laws of math, how we could possibly discover them, and why the physical universe feels compelled to obey them. Don't believe me? There was a secular physicist, Eugene Wigner, brilliant physicist, a PhD in physics. He won a Nobel Prize. The guy is sharp. And he wrote an article that I think is a wonderful article. It's written from a non-Christian perspective called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences. And he's exploring this issue that most people take for granted. We all know the universe obeys math. Yeah, we all know that, but why? Why is it you can write down equations like E equals mc squared and it works? And it allows us to calculate the energy released in an atomic blast and so on. Why is that? He says it's difficult to avoid the impression that a miracle confronts us here, or the two miracles of the existence of the laws of nature and of the human mind's capacity to divine them. He's saying it's amazing enough that there are laws of nature. What's even more amazing is they happen to be convenient mathematical formulas like E equals mc squared that we can discover. That's two miracles. And he's using that tongue in cheek. I don't think he's crediting God with that, unfortunately. So what is the conclusion of this brilliant physicist who apparently is not reasoning from a Christian perspective? I don't know his heart, but his thinking is not Christian, because he'd have the right answer if he were a Christian. What's the answer that he gives from a non-Christian perspective? The miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. He doesn't have one. Now, I'm not making fun of him. The guy's brilliant. He's smarter than I am. But my point is, from a non-Christian perspective, you cannot explain why the physical universe obeys math. You cannot explain fractals, why they exist, why you get these, why would there be beauty built into numbers that's revealed when you run them through that little formula? How does that make sense? Why does the physical universe obey these formulae and therefore produce fractals as well? You can't make sense of it from a secular perspective. So we've seen that beauty of infinite complexity is built into numbers. Numbers are abstract conceptions of quantity. They require a mind. Concepts always require a mind. And yet numbers existed before people. That makes sense in my worldview because I can have a mind before people. The mind of God existed before people. The mind of God existed before the universe. And so the universe, of course, will obey math. Secularists can't answer that. They can't. Because they know numbers require a mind, but they don't have minds before people or before the universe. The secular worldview cannot account for the existence and properties of numbers or mathematical truths. Numbers existed before people, yet their conceptions, meaning they require a mind. And I can make sense of that. You can make sense of that if you're a Christian. Laws of mathematics are universal, invariant, abstract entities that reflects the thinking of God. We've also seen that the physical world contains at least approximate fractals. They don't go on forever, but they go on a certain number of times. And the secular worldview cannot account for why the physical universe obeys math, and therefore why we have fractals physically or not. But the Christian worldview can, because the universe is controlled by the mind of God. We can make sense of that. So the book that covers this topic, and we've almost sold out of them, but Fractals, the Secret Code of Creation, you can get that back there. And it's also included in the book pack. If you get the book pack, that'll come in it. And we can back order too. If we run out of stuff, that's fine. You can back order it. We'll send it to you. Shipping's free if you back order today. So there you go. This book also, it includes the illustrations of what I talked about today and some other ones I didn't have time to talk about today. It also comes with a CD that is computer software that will allow you to explore these shapes. The CD also has every picture in the book on the CD, and you can drop it into the program and continue to zoom in if you want to, which I think is pretty neat. Okay, so you can explore these shapes yourselves, and like I said, you can do it for the rest of your life. Yeah, because it's infinite. So check that out. If you'd like to learn more about this way of reasoning that demonstrates that God does exist and that He is who He claims to be, and how we know that because of the success of science and math and so on, Ultimate Proof of Creation. Fantastic book. I'd encourage you to pick that up. Understanding Genesis, Discerning Truth, Stargazer's Guide to the Night Sky, How to Better Enjoy the Night Sky from a Christian Perspective. That's a fun resource. And I won't go through all of these because I'm already a little bit over time because Jeff went over. Yeah, so it was an amazing presentation. I always enjoy watching that. But he did go over. And it's kind of like original sin. It affects everyone that comes after. So, yeah, so there you go. So check out the book pack as well. Check us out at Biblical Science Institute. Thank you very much. God bless.